In 15,000 BC, somewhere in the caves of what is now Spain, a human hand reached into a dark crevice and pulled out something golden. It was not gold. It was not treasure. It was something far more valuable, a comb of wild honey, dripping with sweetness so intense it must have felt like magic. This moment, this single taste, changed everything. Because before honey, sweetness did not exist for humans. Not like this. Not as a pure, concentrated explosion of energy that could be stored, traded, and even used to preserve the dead. Today, honey sits in a plastic bear-shaped bottle in your kitchen, $1 at any grocery store. But once, it was worth more than gold. It was the first sweet humans ever knew. It was medicine. It was currency. It was the substance that embalmed pharaohs and fueled armies. How did something so ordinary become so sacred? And how did the bee, a tiny insect, become one of the most powerful forces in human history? This is the story of honey. The bee itself is older than humanity. Fossil evidence shows bees have been making honey for at least 80 million years long before the first human ever walked the earth. They evolved alongside flowering plants in the Cretaceous period, a time when dinosaurs still roamed. In those ancient forests, bees and flowers developed a partnership so intimate, so perfect, that it shaped the entire evolution of terrestrial life. The flower offered nectar, a sweet reward. The bee offered transport, carrying pollen from bloom to bloom. Neither could survive without the other. But it would be millions of years before any creature learned to steal that nectar, to raid the hive, to taste the concentrated sweetness that bees had been perfecting for eons. The first humans to encounter honey did not understand it. They saw a swarm, a cloud of stinging insects, a dangerous mystery. But someone, perhaps a child, perhaps a desperate hunter, discovered that the hive held something edible. And once that first taste hit the tongue, there was no going back. Cave paintings in Spain, dating back 8,000 years, show a human figure climbing a rope ladder to reach a wild hive, a basket in hand, surrounded by angry bees. It is the earliest known depiction of honey hunting, and it tells us something profound. From the very beginning, humans were willing to risk everything for sweetness. The stings, the falls, the swarms, none of it mattered. Because honey was not just a treat. It was survival. In ancient Egypt, honey was not food. It was something else entirely. It was the substance of the gods themselves. The Egyptians believed bees were born from the tears of Ra, the sun god, and that honey was a divine gift, a liquid that carried the light of the sun inside it. They used it in religious ceremonies, poured it over altars, mixed it into offerings. But they also used it in ways that seem almost impossible to us today. Honey was medicine. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text from around 1550 BC, lists hundreds of remedies that include honey for wounds, for burns, for infections. And they were right. Modern science has confirmed that honey has antibacterial properties, that it can prevent infection and promote healing. The Egyptians did not know about bacteria. But they knew honey worked. They also knew honey preserved. When a pharaoh died, his body was prepared for the journey to the afterlife. The internal organs were removed. The body was dried with natron. And then it was coated in honey. Yes, honey. The same substance you spread on toast was used to embalm the most powerful rulers of the ancient world. The honey acted as a seal, a preservative, a barrier against decay. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, jars of honey were found, still edible after more than 3,000 years. Archaeologists have opened them and smelled the sweetness, untouched by time. Honey never spoils. It is the only food that lasts forever. And the Egyptians knew this. They buried their dead with honey not just as food for the afterlife, but as a promise that something of this world could endure beyond death. But honey was also a commodity. In ancient Egypt, beekeeping was a state-controlled industry. The pharaoh owned the bees. Hives were kept along the Nile, where the floodplains provided endless flowers. The honey was collected, stored in sealed pottery jars, and distributed as payment to officials, priests, and workers. It was used as currency. A jar of honey could buy a month's labor. It could buy a slave. It could buy a life. The value of honey was so high that it was often counterfeited, mixed with flour, with water, with dates, to stretch the supply. The punishment for selling fake honey was severe. In some periods, it was death, because honey was not just sweetness. It was power. The Egyptians were not alone. Across the ancient world, honey held a similar status. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians used honey in religious rites and as a medicine. In Greece, the gods of Olympus feasted on nectar and ambrosia, both forms of honey. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about the beekeepers of the region around Mount Hymettus, whose honey was so famous it was exported across the Mediterranean. In India, the Vedas describe honey as the essence of life, the nectar of the gods, used in rituals and as a healing substance. In China, honey was prescribed for longevity, for vitality, for treating everything from coughs to digestive problems. Every ancient civilization that encountered honey treated it as something sacred, something rare, something worth fighting for. But the story of honey is not just a story of sweetness. It is a story of trade, of monopoly, of the vast networks that connected the ancient world. By the time of the Roman Empire, honey had become a global commodity. The Romans imported it from Spain, from Greece, from North Africa, from the islands of the Mediterranean. They used it in cooking, in medicine, in religious rites, and in a fermented drink called mulsum honey wine, the drink of the elite. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder devoted entire chapters of his natural history to bees and honey, describing the best varieties, the regions that produced them, and the prices they commanded. A single jar of honey from the island of Corsica could cost more than a slave. And the Romans did not just import honey. They also developed sophisticated beekeeping techniques, using woven baskets and clay pots as hives, moving them seasonally to follow the bloom. This was the birth of migratory beekeeping, a practice still used today. Yet honey remained a luxury. For most of human history, it was too expensive for ordinary people. The poor could not afford it. They used fruits, dates, and other natural sweeteners, but honey was reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, the sick. This scarcity created a constant demand, and that demand drove expansion. As the Roman Empire grew, so did the need for honey. Armies carried it as rations, as medicine, as a source of quick energy. It was used to sweeten wine, to preserve fruit, to make the bitter taste of Roman medicine more palatable. But the supply was limited. The bees could only produce so much. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Because honey was not the only sweetener. In the East, in the forests of India and Southeast Asia, there was another source of sweetness, one that would eventually challenge honey's dominance. It came from a plant, not a bee. It was sugar, and it was about to change everything. But that story is still centuries away. For now, honey reigned supreme. In the early Middle Ages, after the fall of Rome, beekeeping became a vital part of monastic life. Monasteries across Europe kept bees, not just for honey but for beeswax, which was used to make candles for churches. The candle, in a dark world, was a symbol of divine light. And the wax that fueled that light came from the same creature that gave humanity its first taste of sweetness. In medieval England, honey was used to make mead, the drink of warriors and kings. In Scandinavia, it was used to preserve meat and fish. In Eastern Europe, it was a form of currency, a way to pay taxes, a measure of wealth. The word honeymoon comes from this era. A newly married couple was given a month's supply of mead, enough to last through the first moon of their marriage, to ensure fertility and happiness. Honey was woven into the fabric of life, into language, into culture, into the very idea of sweetness itself. But the Middle Ages also saw the dark turn that every commodity story must confront. Because honey was so valuable, it became a target. Beekeeping was not just a peaceful rural craft. It was a source of wealth that attracted the attention of lords, kings, and armies. In many parts of Europe, the right to keep bees belonged only to the nobility. A peasant caught with a hive could be fined, imprisoned, or worse. The honey itself was taxed, regulated, and controlled. This is the part most people never learn about. The history of honey is also a history of theft, of exploitation, of the powerful taking what the poor had built. In the forests of Eastern Europe, where bees nested in hollow trees, whole communities depended on wild honey for survival. The practice was called bortnictwo in Polish, bortniczeństwo in Russian, a form of forest beekeeping that had existed for centuries. Men would climb the tallest trees, using ropes and wooden spikes, to harvest honey from hives that had been carved into the trunks. It was dangerous work. A fall meant death. A sting meant swelling, infection, sometimes death. But the honey was worth the risk. It was the only source of sweetness for hundreds of miles. And it was the only way to pay the taxes that the lords demanded. The lords did not climb trees. They did not risk their lives. But they took the honey. This pattern repeated across the world. In the forests of Mexico, the ancient Maya kept stingless bees, a species native to the Americas, and harvested their honey for medicine, for rituals, for trade. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they saw the value of this honey and demanded it as tribute. The Maya were forced to produce honey for their conquerors, to give up their sacred substance to strangers who did not understand its meaning. And the Spanish brought their own bees with them, the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, a more aggressive and productive species that soon displaced the native bees across the continent. This was not just an invasion of people. It was an invasion of insects, and it changed the ecology of an entire hemisphere. Meanwhile, in Africa, honey had been a central part of life for millennia. In the savannas and forests, wild bees produced enormous stores of honey, and entire communities organized around the harvest. The honey was used as food, as medicine, as a preservative, and as a key ingredient in mead and other fermented drinks. But it also fed the slave trade. European traders, desperate for provisions on their long voyages across the Atlantic, demanded honey from African kingdoms. And those kingdoms, in turn, demanded more from their people. The honey trade became entangled with the human trade, a bitter irony that few history books mention. The sweetness of honey helped fuel one of the darkest chapters in human history. The 18th and 19th centuries brought a revolution that would transform honey forever. For thousands of years, beekeeping had been a destructive practice. To harvest honey, you had to destroy the hive. You had to kill the bees, or at least drive them away, burning sulfur to smoke them out, then breaking open the comb and taking everything. The bees would die, the hive would be lost, and the beekeeper would have to start again, hoping to attract a new swarm. It was a cycle of destruction and renewal, as old as beekeeping itself. Then came a man named Lorenzo Langstroth. In 1851, an American pastor and amateur beekeeper made a discovery that changed everything. He noticed that bees left a precise gap between the combs in their hive exactly 3/8 of an inch. If the gap was any smaller, they would fill it with propolis, a sticky resin. If it was any larger, they would build extra comb to bridge the space. But at exactly 3/8 of an inch, they left it open. This was the bee space, and Langstroth realized he could use it. He designed a hive with movable frames, each frame separated by exactly that bee space. The bees would build their comb on the frames, but because of the gap, they would not attach the comb to the walls of the hive. The beekeeper could simply lift out a frame, inspect the hive, harvest the honey, and put the frame back without killing a single bee. It was a revolution. For the first time in history, beekeeping became a sustainable industry. The Langstroth hive, as it came to be known, is still the standard today, used by beekeepers around the world. This innovation did not just make honey cheaper. It made it abundant. Suddenly, honey was no longer a luxury reserved for the rich. It was a commodity that could be produced at scale, shipped across continents, and sold to anyone. By the late 19th century, honey was being exported from the United States to Europe, from Europe to Asia, from Asia to Africa. The price fell, the availability rose, and the taste of honey, once a rare and sacred experience, became ordinary. But there was a catch. The same technology that made honey abundant also made it vulnerable. The Langstroth hive allowed beekeepers to move their bees easily, to transport them across the country, to follow the bloom from Florida to California. This was good for honey production, but it was also good for disease. When bees are crowded together, stressed by travel, exposed to new environments, they become susceptible to illness. And once a disease enters a hive, it spreads fast. In the 20th century, a series of parasites and pathogens swept through the world's bee populations, devastating colonies and threatening the entire honey industry. The most famous of these is the Varroa destructor mite, a tiny parasite that feeds on bee larvae and spreads viruses. It arrived in the United States in the 1980s and within a decade had infected nearly every hive in the country. Beekeepers fought back with chemicals, with breeding programs, with new management techniques. But the mite is still here, and it is still killing bees. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the problem is not just the mite. The problem is us. In the modern world, honey is produced on an industrial scale. The United States alone produces over 150 million pounds of honey every year. But that is not enough. The country imports even more from Vietnam, from Argentina, from India, from Ukraine. Global honey production has tripled in the last 50 years. And with that growth has come a shadow industry, adulteration. It is estimated that up to 30% of the honey sold in commercial markets is not pure honey. It is mixed with corn syrup, with rice syrup, with sugar water, with artificial flavorings. It is filtered so aggressively that the pollen is removed, making it impossible to trace its origin. It is heated to high temperatures to kill any yeast, destroying the natural enzymes that make honey a living food. The honey on your shelf may never have been touched by a bee. It may be nothing more than flavored sugar. The problem is so widespread that governments have struggled to regulate it. The European Union has tested hundreds of honey samples and found that nearly 1 in 5 was adulterated. In some markets, the number is much higher. And the adulteration is not just a fraud against the consumer. It is a fraud against the bees. Because when honey is cheap and fake, real honey cannot compete. Beekeepers, who spend their lives caring for their hives, who lose colonies to disease and pesticides and climate change, cannot sell their product at a fair price. They are driven out of business. And the bees, the creatures that have been our partners for 10,000 years, are left to fend for themselves in a world that no longer values them. But the crisis goes deeper. In the last 2 decades, scientists have documented a phenomenon called colony collapse disorder. Entire hives, seemingly healthy, suddenly empty. The worker bees disappear, leaving behind the queen, the brood, and the honey. No one knows exactly why. The leading theories point to a combination of factors. Pesticides, particularly a class of chemicals called neonicotinoids that attack the bee's nervous system. Habitat loss, as wildflowers are replaced by monoculture crops, pathogens, spread by the global trade in bees, and stress, from the constant movement of hives across the country to pollinate almonds in California, apples in Washington, blueberries in Maine. The bees are dying, and we are the cause. Think about that for a second. The bee, the creature that gave humanity its first taste of sweetness, that has been our companion since the dawn of civilization, that is responsible for pollinating 1/3 of the food we eat, that bee is disappearing. And if the bee disappears, so does the honey. So do the apples, the almonds, the blueberries, the cherries, the cucumbers, the melons. So does the world as we know it. This is not a distant threat. This is happening now. In the United States, beekeepers lost nearly 40% of their colonies in the past year. In Europe, the numbers are similar. In China, where hand pollination of fruit trees has become necessary because there are not enough bees, the future is already here. And it is not sweet. But here's the thing about bees. They are resilient. They have survived ice ages, mass extinctions, the rise and fall of empires. They have been making honey for 80 million years, long before we existed. And they will probably be making it long after we are gone. The question is not whether bees will survive. The question is whether we will choose to keep them. Because beekeeping is not just a way to produce honey. It is a relationship. It is a partnership between humans and insects, one of the oldest partnerships in the world. When you keep bees, you learn to read them. You learn to watch the entrance of the hive, to see the pollen coming in, to hear the hum that tells you they are healthy. You learn to move slowly, to respect their space, to understand that you are a guest in their home. And when you harvest the honey, you leave enough for them. You never take everything. Because the honey is not yours. It is theirs. You are just borrowing it. This is the lesson that honey teaches us. The sweetness of life is not something we can take. It is something we must share. The bee does not hoard its honey. It shares it with the hive, with the flowers it pollinates, with the humans who care for it. And in return, the hive thrives. The flowers bloom. The honey flows. It is a cycle of generosity that has sustained life on this planet for millions of years. And we, the latecomers, the newcomers, the ones who arrived only yesterday in evolutionary time, we are part of that cycle, whether we know it or not. So the next time you open a jar of honey, think about what you are holding. You are holding the labor of 60,000 bees, each one flying thousands of miles to collect nectar from millions of flowers. You are holding the sweetness of the sun, transformed by a creature that has been perfecting its craft for longer than humanity has existed. You are holding a substance that never spoils, that was used to embalm pharaohs, that was worth more than gold, that has been traded across continents and fought over by empires. You are holding the first sweet humans ever knew, and it is sitting in your kitchen right now, in a plastic bottle, $1 at any store. How did something so sacred become so ordinary? The answer is in every drop. But here's the thing about honey. It does not care about our stories. It does not care about the empires that rose and fell in its name. It does not care about the pharaohs, the traders, the slaves, the beekeepers who risked their lives to harvest it. Honey just is. It is a natural substance, a chemical miracle, a gift from a creature that does not know it is giving. And maybe that is the most profound truth of all. The things we treasure most, the things we build our civilizations around, the things we fight and die for, they are often just accidents of nature, gifts we did not earn, blessings we do not deserve. The bee does not know it is sacred. It just makes honey. It just pollinates flowers. It just lives its tiny, short life, working from sunrise to sunset, and then it dies. And in dying, it gives life to everything else. That is the real story of honey. Not the story of empires and trade and wealth, but the story of a small creature that has been quietly sustaining the world for 80 million years, without asking for anything in return. And that is a story worth remembering. If this surprised you, if it changed the way you look at that jar in your kitchen, subscribe to Forgotten Flavors. We cover a story like this every week, the hidden history of the ordinary things that shape your life. And leave a comment. Which part of honey's story surprised you the most? Was it the embalming? The ancient value? The adulteration? Or the bee itself? I read every comment. And I will see you in the next one.